history of sea power has left no mark on the face of the world's oceans. No visible memorials, no ruins. Yet the struggle for dominance at sea has determined the political, military, and commercial destiny for most of the world for the last 400 years. The protection of a nation's commerce and the denial of the sea to its adversaries is the aim of sea power. Its methods are three: destroy the enemy's navy, blockade their ports, and if need be capable of amphibious assault. The last two being dependent on the first. By the end of the 16th century, the age of exploration, dominated by Portugal and Spain, had given way to colonization and then to trade. Dominance at sea was still to be determined. England was first to adapt its financial institutions to the unique demands of mounting and maintaining a dominant fleet of warships.
The English set up a system whereby every government loan, everything that was raised from the moneylenders, from the markets in London or Amsterdam, had to be tied to a specific form of income. And this kind of guarantee of gilt-edged bonds floated by the British government, guaranteed by Parliament, underpinned by identifying the additional source of revenue, and always paid back in time, was the secret weapon of the much smaller English nation for hundreds and hundreds of years.
In order to manage its borrowings, what would come to be called the national debt, the British created two institutions that, along with their navy, would form the foundations of its empire.
The Bank of England and the stock market are also creations of this inventive fiscal period of the late 17th century. And they work hand in hand, because the Bank of England is to be independent. It's not to be a poodle of the government. And this, I think, is really, really critical part of the story. It's credit worthiness. If you have it, you have an immense intangible resource which your enemies find it hard to match. If you lose your credit worthiness, you've lost more than just some gold flowing out. You've lost a reputation for solidity which carry you in good times and in bad.
The ruler of Europe's greatest land power, Louis XIV of France, craved the same preeminence at sea as he exercised on land, and set about building a large navy. The English had no doubt that they were the target of Louis's sudden interest in the sea.
Shall a prince so wise make all these preparations to sail over land and fall upon the back of Hungary? Lord Shaftesbury.
The French vision was an imperial one. New France along the St. Lawrence, in Acadia, and the rich sugar and coffee colonies of the West Indies were to be the source of a new and lucrative trade. But this required a large merchant marine and a powerful and expensive navy, both of which had to be paid for.
The French king, though he commanded a far larger population and far greater national resources, did not have a very effective taxation system. It was episodic, it was unfair, it was irregular. Too much money went into the hand of tax collectors and factors and was not passed to the king. He didn't have a good reserve financial system, so that when he got into war, which he very frequently got into, he could not rely so much upon taxes to pay for the costs of his armies and navies. He therefore had to go to the moneylenders, Amsterdam, Lyon, Geneva, and not being able to pay back those moneylenders as fast as their terms required, his creditworthiness was weak.
Once built, the French Navy began to rot while remaining safe in its harbors at Brest on the Atlantic and Toulon in the Mediterranean. Its only role was to tie up English naval strength. This division of the French fleet was made almost permanent by the English seizure of Gibraltar in 1704. France turned to privateering as the English had against the Spanish 100 years earlier. French ships slipped in and out of Brest and took a significant toll on English shipping, but were of little help to her fledgling colonies overseas. The French, like the Spanish, had adopted a convoy system to maintain contact with its populated overseas possessions. Ships from the sugar and coffee plantations in the West Indies sailed up the American coast to the elaborate and costly fortress of Louisbourg that Louis XIV had constructed on Cape Breton Island. Joined by ships from Quebec, these sailed home in convoy, protected, in theory at least, by the French Navy. England and France fought 3 wars lasting a total of 29 years between 1689 and 1748, from each of which the British emerged victorious. But the true test of strength between them would be delayed until the second half of the 18th century. When it came, it was at a time and place of England's choosing. An alliance with Prussia kept France and her allies busy in Europe, while England set out to destroy her colonial empire. William Pitt, the British First Minister under George II, appointed the austere professional George Anson as First Lord of the Admiralty, who invented a naval strategy to achieve his grand design. It had to protect both Britain and Britain's overseas colonies and still be able to defeat any French fleet that could be sent against it.
Our colonies are so numerous and extensive that to keep a naval force at each equal to the united force of France would be impractical with double our navy. The best defense against invasion, therefore, for our colonies as well as our coasts, is to have such a squadron always to the westward, as may in all probability either keep the French in port or give them battle with advantage if they come out.
In 1756, at the beginning of what would be known as the 7 Years' War, France had 63 ships of the line, Spain, her eventual ally, 46, compared to Britain's 120. The great fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, which was Louis XIV's greatest extravagance after Versailles, fell in 1758. 9 months later, Britain was prepared to deliver the killing blow that would define the future of the North American continent. Despite the loss of Louisbourg, the French made few preparations except to bolster Quebec's garrison of French troops. One reason was that the governor of New France, Vaudreuil, did not believe that large British warships could navigate the St. Lawrence.
The British approach to Quebec is a really remarkable feat of seamanship by any standard at all. The St. Lawrence is a dreadful place to sail for a number of reasons. One, there's quite a flow in the river, particularly along the south shore, where there are no good harbors. So you'd have to make your way against the current and with no secure anchorages if you get into mischief. The logical place along which to sail is the north shore, but that's along a high line of hills, which creates problems with wind. The net result is it's a difficult place to sail. But the British were able, under Saunders and actually under James Cook, who surveys the river for the expedition, to find their way up to just before the island of Orleans without pilots, and then make that difficult passage through the Traverse past Orleans up to Quebec, using a combination of their own native ability, some pretty skilled old Thames River pilots and some surveys, and a few pilots that they conscripted for the passage.
The Traverse was so named because any ship would have to cross the river to another channel against a 9-knot current. They would be forced to move slowly and to turn sideways, a sitting duck for guns mounted on the cliffs above. But there were no guns. Baudry, the governor, had rescinded Montcalm's order to place guns there. Later, he would exclaim, "The English have passed 60 ships of war where we hardly dared risk a ship of 100 tons."
French continually surprised by the boldness of the English, and I think this gets back to training. There are things that Navy could do that very few other navies thought feasible. Here's another element in the story. You build up a sense of morale in your forces, which again is intangible, but we just know it's there as a very powerful factor.
General James Wolfe, the British commander, all but despaired when he saw Quebec's high cliffs and fortifications. He wrote Prime Minister Pitt that it appeared to be the strongest position in the world. But he noticed with surprise that the heights at Point Levy, directly across the river from Quebec, had been left unoccupied and unprotected. But Montcalm expressed scorn for the rest of Wolfe's deployment, a landing on the eastern shore of the Montmorency River. When General Levy, his second-in-command, offered to drive the English from their position, Montcalm replied,
"Why force them from where they can do no harm to somewhere where they might?"
After 2 months of pointless and costly activity and an attack on the British fleet by fireships, which failed, Wolfe, sick and in despair, turned to his brigadiers for guidance. They in turn consulted Admiral Saunders, the commander of the fleet. He suggested making the St. Lawrence the line of battle, using his ships to move the army above the town, where their presence would threaten a landing up the river from Quebec. Wolfe rejected a plan from his brigadiers to land his army some 9 miles above Quebec at Cap Rouge. It would require a march through the forest to reach the town and might expose them to Indian attack. Wolfe also had to leave a considerable number of troops to guard the battery at Point Levy, since its loss would have trapped his army, and now much of his navy above Quebec. Wolfe decided that rather than divide his forces, he must land as close to the town as possible. He chose to attack at a place much closer to the town, and at night. Surprise was vital. The amphibious assault was to take place 1 hour before dawn on September 13th. By 2 a.m., all the British force, some 4,500 men with their equipment, was in motion, floating silently but rapidly down the river.
Then, with the following breeze from the west, and under a clouding sky which was reddened and torn by the flash and thunder of artillery in the east, that tense and silent British army swept down the mighty river with the ebbing tide, between those sheer black banks and into the heart of that expectant night, to carry out a plan laid with such daring skill and to win one of the great immortal battles of the world. Major William Wood, historian.
The landing placed the British between Quebec and its source of supply in Montreal, and compelled Montcalm to abandon the protection of the walls of the city in an attempt to force the British back to their boats. Montcalm had placed a regiment where the British had landed. Vaudreuil had ordered it withdrawn and had not informed Montcalm. This was the source of his famous remark: "There they are where they have no right to be." One double-shot volley by the British on the Plains of Abraham sealed the fate of New France and temporarily united the eastern half of North America under British rule. The victory differed only in scale from the Viking assaults 900 years before, but numbers mattered. If an army could be landed from a swift-flowing river in the dark of night, 1,000 miles from the ocean, no coastline anywhere was immune to attack. Later, in what would be called the Miracle Year, Annus Mirabilis, 1759, came the stunning victory of Quiberon Bay in Brittany. A large French fleet trying to escape the blockade and support a landing in Scotland was spotted by a British fleet, which gave chase. In a rising gale and with darkness falling, Admiral Hawke pursued the French into the dangerous waters of the bay, to the amazement of the French Admiral Conflans.
I had no reason to believe that if I went in first with my ships, the enemy would dare to follow, in spite of his strength, which would, in any case, confine his movements in such a limited area. Admiral Conflans.
Two British ships were lost in the dangerous shoals, but the French lost 7 ships of the line. 2 sank in minutes, capsizing as the Mary Rose had done more than 2 centuries before, when their open gun ports dipped beneath the wild seas. The destruction of the French fleet at Quiberon Bay prevented any further attempt by the French to reconquer Quebec, and weakened her position everywhere. The next major British victory was in India, where after 5 inconclusive sea battles, France was forced to withdraw, abandoning her colonies there. The French then made an alliance with Spain, whose fleet was still considered formidable. But widening the war simply increased British opportunities. In the West Indies, they invaded and reduced the French possessions of Martinique, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. They attacked the Spanish and captured Havana, which resulted in the destruction of 12 ships and the appropriation of £3 million of Spanish gold. Next, they attacked Acapulco and the Philippines.
Never had the colonial empire of Spain received such blows. Spain, whose opportune intervention might have changed the fate of the war, entered it too late to save France, but in time to share her misfortunes. A.T. Mahan.
La Perouse Bouffy, a Frenchman, wrote of France's neglect of its fleet and its reliance on harassing tactics and privateering.
Want of money, the depression of commerce, given over to English merchant ships, the lack of good ships, and the lack of supplies. All these compelled the French government to replace the only rational system of war, total war, by a sort of game in which the great aim is not to get caught. La Perouse Bouffy.
It is safe to say that in the 7 Years' War, only the mind of William Pitt encompassed the new meaning naval power had given to total war, which mobilized a whole nation to a thought-out and developed strategic plan. Pitt is the model of the commander-in-chief, characterized by unity of purpose, consistency, and decisiveness. In the chess game of war, he saw the board as a whole. G.B. Potter.
It's hard to think of an 18th century war that cemented any nation's power more than the 7 Years' War cemented that of Great Britain. In the end, by the time that war was over, they virtually had gobbled up whatever colonies overseas that they really felt they needed to take.
After 1763, a nation attempting to reap the golden harvest of an ocean commerce and the ability to maintain a fleet at sea depended on whether England would permit it. The great watery wastes of the world, the trackless commons, while they could not be owned or shared, could be controlled. The superpower, not yet called that, had been born. But it came at a price. The official count of Royal Navy casualties read, numbers of sailors and Marines employed, 184,893. Killed in action, 1,512. Died of sickness or missing, 133,708, a casualty rate of 69%. Because of her merchant marine, the British advantage in experienced seamen was 5-1 compared to France, even greater than her advantage in ships. British sailors, the foundation of British success, were literally bound to the sea and in service for life.
The only ways in which a man left the Navy was by death, desertion, or being paid off. There was no such thing as superannuation. Major William Wood, historian.
Tobias Smollett, the novelist, was a junior surgeon's mate in the West Indies in 1740. Just before the Battle of Cartagena, he left this account of the sick bay.
I saw almost 50 miserable, distempered wretches, suspended in rows, huddled one on another, and deprived of light of day as well as fresh air, breathing nothing but a noxious atmosphere of morbid streams, exhaling from their own diseased bodies, devoured with vermin hatched in the filth that surrounded them, and destitute of every convenience necessary for people in that helpless condition. A man in jail has more room, better food, and commonly better company. No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into jail, for being in a ship is being in jail, with the chance of being drowned. Samuel Johnson. Among the wounded was a brave fellow named Wells. After the surgeon had amputated and dressed his arm, he walked about in fine spirits, as if he had received only a minor injury. I've lost my arm in the service of my country, but I don't mind, doctor. It is the fortune of war. Cheerful and gay as he was, he soon died.
If they did not die of wounds, disease took its toll. Admiral Anson took his fleet around the world in 1740 with 1,445 men. When he returned 4 years later, he had only 145 of the original sailors left.
Their provisions consisted of putrid salt beef, to which the sailor gave the name Irish horse, a salt pork of New England, which, though neither fish nor flesh, savored of both. Bread from the same country, every biscuit like a piece of clockwork, moved by its own internal impulse, because of the insects that dwelt within it. These vile rations were supplemented by half a pint of cutthroat rum every day, and the men could get as much more of the fiery stuff as they could pay for. Tobias Smollett.
Such humanity as there was mainly attributable to individual commanders. Captain James Cook, who sailed around the world only 30 years after Anson's terrible voyage, brought most of his crew back safely. The American Revolution presented France with an opportunity for revenge. To placate its new colony of Quebec, Britain left it in control of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, coveted by the American colonists. As a consequence of this and other grievances, the 13 American colonies declared their independence from Britain only 13 years after the Treaty of Paris concluded the 7 Years' War, and ceded Canada and Acadia to Britain. France, nursing its pride and very real wounds, still had power enough to ensure that the colonists' rebellion would succeed, and spared no effort or expense in seeing that it did.
The French Navy gets absolutely smoked in the 7 Years' War, and they know it. The French Navy actually begins a process of rebuilding itself about 1759, 1760. And they undergo some really radical reforms. And under the Duc de Choiseul, who takes over the French Navy through the 1760s and 1770s, the French Navy actually is built up again. And so by the time we get down to the American Revolution in the 1770s, the French Navy is actually in better shape than the British Navy is. It has more ships of the line in service. What it lacks is, it lacks that depth. It lacks the infrastructure behind it to support it. Yes, it has dockyards, and yes, it has people, but it doesn't have that moneyed class behind it. And so there's this brief shining moment when the French Navy is really very good.
The climax for French intervention came in 1781, when the French General Lafayette maneuvered the English General Cornwallis into a retreat that left his army with its back to the sea at Yorktown, Virginia, where they waited for the Royal Navy to rescue them. The French fleet, under the Count de Grasse, arrived instead.
Once the French dropped anchor between the opposing headlands at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay, Cape Henry and Cape Charles, which gave their name to the ensuing battle, the Battle of the Virginia Capes. Once the French were in that position, Cornwallis at Yorktown was trapped between the American and French forces on land and the French Navy at sea. The only chance he had to escape was if the British Navy coming down from New York could drive off the French. The French came out of the Capes, higgledy-piggledy, not in a clear line of battle, kind of in evident confusion, and Admiral Hood urged an immediate descent upon the French while they were in disorder and confusion.
Towards evening, the two fleets finally closed with their two lines roughly opposite each other. The British were in their favorite position, to windward, which allowed them the greatest range to maneuver. Admiral Graves hoisted the famous red signal for close action between the ships, but underneath was another flag that required them to maintain their line of battle.
But that's two different things, and the problem is which one takes priority. The enemy was off to starboard. To engage the enemy, Hood would have had to break the line and fall down upon his counterpart in the French line. But to do so, he would have to leave the line of battle. And whether he was acting out of pique or stubbornness or simply literal-mindedness, his decision was to maintain the line of battle even though it kept him out of cannon range from the French fleet, so that while the vans of the two fleet engaged in action with one another, the rear echelon in both squadrons remained out of cannon shot.
Night fell before the rest of the fleet could become involved, and the opportunity for a decisive engagement was lost.
The French were able to use the lever of sea power in a way which reverberated onto the land battle and reminds us that sea power and land power go hand in hand, and that as people like the elder Pitt and Churchill recognized, you use one to reinforce the other, not in competition with the other.
That night, the French were reinforced by a squadron from the north. Now the Count de Grasse had 36 ships to the British 18. Graves had no option but to withdraw. The French now moved some of their heavy naval guns on shore, where they pounded Cornwallis's trapped army. Cornwallis surrendered, and Britain effectively abandoned her original American colonies, giving birth to the nation that would one day replace her as the world's greatest naval power.
I wish it was in my power to express to Congress how much I feel myself indebted to the Count de Grasse and his fleet. George Washington, October 19th, 1781.
The man whom Washington should have thanked was General Rochambeau, the French commander who had planned the whole campaign that had trapped Cornwallis. The British general had no doubt who had beaten him and attempted to surrender to General Rochambeau, who courteously directed the surrender party to capitulate to Washington. The French revenge for the loss of Canada had been swift, but their victory had not altered the balance of power between France and England at sea. 10 years after the war, British-American trade was more than twice what it had been when America was her colony. While the results of the war benefited British commerce and ultimately the British treasury, Britain had had to incur a large debt in first winning and then losing most of North America. In 1757, the national debt stood at £57 million. 30 years later, it had increased almost 5 times to £240 million, amounting to 98% of the Treasury's annual revenues.
Since, by coincidence, the war with America overlaps the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and the production of new manufactures, what happens is that within about 10 to 15 years of the independence of the United States, it becomes the #1 customer for British exports, it and India. And these are long-distance trades, and therefore they reinforce your merchant marine.
But it was not British power that preoccupied Europe as the 18th century drew to a close. Napoleon Bonaparte, an energetic Corsican and a military genius, had emerged from the Revolution as Emperor of France. Napoleon's army swept over most of Europe, winning battle after battle. Had it not been for the Royal Navy, which protected England from invasion and maintained the overseas trade that made her formidable, Napoleon's triumphs might have changed the map of Europe forever. Instead, Britain forced Napoleon into an exhausting war with Spain and Portugal, who fought on, assisted by Britain and supplied by the Royal Navy. It was in these campaigns against France that Horatio Nelson first gained recognition as England's greatest naval commander.
He was Superman and everyman, and that's, I think, what makes him attractive. He had visible feet of clay, the fact that he committed adultery with one of the most beautiful women of his day, and 2 times with her husband, who was his best friend, treated his wife very cruelly in the process, that he was irritable and given to vanity and all that sort of thing. I think that, in a way, adds to his attractiveness because it makes him accessible. And certainly, the key about Nelson was that he was a very lovable man. That word is often used, often by people who served with him, as well as his family and friends.
Nelson was leading the rear squadron in an attack on a Spanish fleet near Cape St. Vincent in 1797. As the fleet commander, Admiral John Jervis maneuvered to bring the British fleet into a conventional line-astern formation.
Jervis was completely outnumbered, almost 2 to 1 by the Spanish fleet, and yet he knew that he had a very highly trained, very professional set of men and officers and well honed up ships, and so he took the risk of taking on this large fleet, knowing that if he beat it, he would save England from an invasion. He drove his ships into a gap that the Spanish had allowed to open up into their line. Instead of lining up in 2 parallel lines, as tended to happen in battles before then, Jervis, in fact, went straight at them.
It became obvious to Nelson that the fleet maneuver ordered by Jervis would never catch the Spanish. They would escape with their fleet intact. In a daring breach of his orders, Nelson left the line of battle to cut off the Spanish flagship and prevent that from happening. Nelson's unexpected maneuver threw the Spanish into disarray and allowed the rest of the British fleet to catch up and engage.
Nelson then laid his ship alongside a larger Spanish ship, the San Nicolas, and personally led a boarding party up the side of the San Nicolas and captured her. But he still hasn't finished. Alongside him is an even bigger Spanish ship, the San Josef, a 3-decker, towering over the San Nicolas. He could have been defeated if he had hesitated or retreated. Instead, he did the bold thing. He led his men again up the sides of the San Josef and captured her. And so he personally led the boarding parties that captured 2 Spanish ships. And it was that great feat, above all, the boarding feat, which first made him a popular hero in England and brought him to the public attention.
Jervis, himself a new breed of admiral, responded to another officer's criticism of Nelson's disobedience. Disobedience it certainly was, and if you can guarantee me the same results as Nelson, if you ever commit such a breach of your orders, I will forgive you also.
Nelson had a very special quality about him, a quality that was almost a mixture of ruthlessness, but also a quality of knowing exactly where he wanted to go and how he was going to achieve it. And in order to do that, of course, you have to have a bit of ruthlessness. So there was that sense of his special calling. He believed that he was called to lead the Royal Navy to great victories. He believed that God was on his side.
On October 21st, 1805, 27 ships of the line of the Royal Navy attacked 33 French and Spanish ships off the coast of Cadiz, near Cape Trafalgar. 2 lines of British ships split the enemy's fleet into smaller sections, which were then destroyed by superior concentrations of Royal Navy fire. A shot from the rigging of an enemy ship struck and mortally wounded Nelson. England's grief at his death was unmatched by the death of any other commander before or since. Nelson's death dramatized the fact that, At sea, officers faced the same dangers as their men.
The famous phrase that he himself used, quoting Shakespeare, who was his favourite playwright, was his band of brothers. That's the name that he used for the captains that served with him at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. That, of course, is a quote from Henry V. We happy few, we band of brothers. At the Battle of Trafalgar, he took command of the fleet outside Cadiz just 3 weeks before the battle, and yet in just that short time, he was able to weave a similar spell around a very disparate group of some 30 or 40 captains and make them as enthusiastic as the band of brothers had been, who he'd known for many years.
Ultimately, Trafalgar was a victory not only of a brilliant commander, but of a naval philosophy. The commitment of an ambitious nation to maintain its superiority at sea, whatever price that demanded. British superiority at sea would be the true cause of Napoleon's eventual defeat 10 years later.
After the Battle of Waterloo, the final overthrow of Napoleon, the great Prussian general Gneisenau points to Napoleon and says, it's that guy Napoleon who, by his sheer arrogance and aggressiveness, has led to England's rise to be undisputed #1 power. Without England and without the Royal Navy and without the colonial trades which boom and which pay the taxes, it's unlikely that those European allies could have sustained themselves. By the later stages of the Napoleonic War, Britain is giving hundreds of millions of pounds in subsidies to allies and mercenary forces up and down Europe. It's a colossal drain on the exchequer, but it's paid for because the Royal Navy has, after Trafalgar, established almost complete command of the sea and of the colonial trades, and has seized all the French and French allied colonies, and can pay for the war, a war which is the most ruinous financially in all of history.
Once Britain becomes the dominant maritime power, and then by the latter part of the 18th century it becomes the dominant industrial power in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, the British are actually able to usurp and dominate their enemies' trade, even while they're at war with them. There are two marvelous examples of this. The British continue to trade with the French all through the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars. Trade never stops. So when a French ship is captured by a British privateer, it's brought into a British port. It's condemned as a prize. The goods are sold, the ship is sold. The French agent then has to find another ship if he wants to continue it. So he ends up in the Pool of London looking at the ships that have been condemned as privateers, and takes the insurance money which he got from Lloyd's of London, and then buys another ship and takes it to sea, and then reinsures that ship through Lloyd's of London, and then continues to sail it, hopefully without being intercepted or using a neutral flag, until it's captured again, whereupon the English take the whole thing back, sell it, condemn the prize, and the whole process begins again.
The combination of British financial and naval preeminence, each dependent on the other, became an accepted reality over the whole globe. With it came an unprecedented flood of national songs and symbols, including Rule Britannia, the words of which give some indication of British pride and arrogance. When Britain first, at heaven's command, arose from out the azure main, this was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang this strain: Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. The nations not so blessed as thee must in their turns to tyrants fall. While thou shalt flourish great and free, the dread and envy of them all. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britain's 200 years of struggle would in the next century give way to a British peace over all the world's seas and oceans, marking the birth of the first global superpower.